Good morning, Sugar Grove. So this is normally where Doug says, "Hi, I'm Doug Robinson. I'm the lead minister." And Doug has a Sunday off today. Michael Potoff was supposed to fill in for Doug today. And Michael is dealing with some kidney stones, I think, and recovering. So you're here. You can preach. I can pass this. Okay. So Michael would normally be the one saying he's not Doug, but Michael wasn't able to be ready for this morning. Normally, I think it would then go back to Kirk Cowell, who is having a weekend vacation in a place called Utopia, which sounds great. So it has come to me to tell you I am not Doug or Michael or Mark. I am your fourth string quarterback this morning. My name is Kirk. I sit over there with my wife and kids. My wife is sick. My daughter's sick. My other two kids are here, and we're going to do the best we can. You notice I'm not fully prepared to preach. They told me I was going to preach, and I forgot to untuck my shirt, which I'm super embarrassed about. I have no tattoos, and my shirt is tucked in, and I have no idea how this is going to go this morning, so just bear with me. And we'll do the best we can here with your middle school JV scrimmage quarterback for the day. I want to start off talking about my second favorite TV show from the 1970s. I know it's an exciting topic. All right. My first favorite TV show when I was a kid, which was actually from the late 60s, was Star Trek. Who can fault me, right? All right, and I'm just old enough to have been a Star Trek fan when there was only one series, just the one, before The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager and the one we don't talk about, and before the movies, all right, I was a fan. But my second favorite TV show only ran 2 seasons, ran from about 1977 to 1978, 79, 36 episodes, has been almost forgotten. And probably most of you here under 40 have no idea what this show is, unlike Star Trek, which continues chugging along. My second favorite show was The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams. Thank you. And if you don't know The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams, here's the basic setup. Here's this man who's accused of a murder he didn't commit in like the late early 1900s, runs off, becomes a mountain man, lives all by himself, except he rescues a bear cub who is stranded on a cliffside, and this cub grows up to be his best friend and protector, so he gets the nickname Grizzly Adams, and it's Grizzly Adams and his cub, now full-grown bear, who have all these adventures. And to tell you the truth, I do not remember a single plot line, any episode of that show. I'm not sure that it's necessarily the plots that attracted me. What I really loved about that show was the introduction, where Grizzly's friend, Mad Jack, tells the story of the legend of Grizzly Adams and how he came to live in the woods. And then they played this very 1970s Flutes and Hippies theme song. And the lyrics of the theme song said this: "Deep inside the forest is a door into another world. Here is our life and home. We are staying here forever in the beauty of this place all alone. But we keep on hoping. Maybe there's a world where we won't have to run. Maybe there's a time we'll call our own, living free in harmony and majesty. Take me home, take me home." And I think even as a 5-year-old kid watching the show, there was something so powerful and compelling about that idea that somewhere out there is a different world with different rules. Somewhere out there is a world where people are not falsely accused. Somewhere out there is a world where people don't have to run away from evil because evil has been vanquished. Somewhere is a place where we don't have to run, where there is peace and harmony. If I could just find that door. In fact, I think a lot of the movies and TV shows that I loved as a kid offer that same kind of promise that if you could just find it, there's a door somewhere that will take you someplace better. First movie I remember seeing is Star Wars. And again, that's what it was called. It was not episode anything. It was not A New Hope. It was Star Wars, only one of them. My grandfather took me when I was 5, and I remember back at my grandparents' house after the movie, my grandfather's ashtray, because people smoked back then, was sitting on the dining room table and smoke wafting up from his pipe. And when nobody's looking, I kind of hold out my hand, see if I can force lift that ashtray just a little bit up off the table. Maybe I'm part of this special world. Maybe I'm force sensitive. Maybe I can do something. I read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe a couple years later. And whenever I was at somebody's house who had a wardrobe, would just kind of, when nobody's looking, open the doors, move the coats aside, sort of knock on the back of that wardrobe. Is there a hidden door into another land? The text we're going to read this morning from Isaiah will invite you into a world that does not fully exist. It will invite you into a world of peace and harmony and majesty, but a world that not everybody can see. It will invite you into a world that is coming and is not yet fully here, but it offers that invitation. We'll be reading from Isaiah 55 in just a little bit. So go ahead, if you have your Bibles or your Bible app, or you've just memorized it, access Isaiah 55, however you would like to. I want to quickly review the last couple of weeks, in case you've missed the last 2 Sundays. Because Isaiah 40 through 55 is a very distinct unit within the book of Isaiah, which is dealing with this question of the Israelites who have seen their homeland destroyed by Babylon, who have seen Jerusalem laid siege and the temple looted, who have seen their princes murdered and their king blinded and carted away in chains, and are now living in a foreign land. And at the end of their exile, as God is calling them to go back to their home, they are dealing with how do they process this tragedy. So 2 weeks ago, when I was preaching and knew I was going to preach, I talked about this tension in Isaiah 40 between the God who calls out, "Comfort, comfort, comfort my people," and the people who are not yet ready to listen. And Isaiah 40, verse 27, which talks about the people who are saying, "Our God has abandoned us, our God does not care about us." And so the answer, I think, that Isaiah presents to this dilemma of hurting, bruised people is God calling for all of Israel to become his servants. And he gives his servants a very particular commission. A bruised reed he will not break. A smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his teaching, the islands will put their hope. And I find this picture so extraordinarily beautiful that we have such broken and useless things. Bruised reeds, smoldering wicks, and instead of doing what any sensible person would do and throw those things away, in God's economy, the servants of God take those bruised reeds and weave them into a beautiful basket where the strength of the other reeds supports the bruised parts. And instead of throwing away the smoldering wicks, the servants of God gently whittle away the frayed and the burned places until that wick shines brightly again. Isaiah is calling for a community of mutual healing and redemption. In contrast to that, there are some in Babylon who have decided that God clearly does not care about them. And so they have turned to idols. There's a wonderful passage in Isaiah 44 where Isaiah describes sort of the futility and the senselessness of turning to idols for your hope and your satisfaction. Here's how Isaiah describes it. Chapter 44, verse 15. He's talking about a carpenter, a wood craftsman. And he says he cut down cedars, or perhaps took a cypress or an oak. He let it grow among the trees of the forest, or he planted a pine, and the rain made it grow. It's used as fuel for burning, but some of it he takes and warms himself. He kindles a fire, he bakes bread, and he also fashions a god and worships it. He makes an idol and bows down to it. Half the wood he burns in the fire. Over it he prepares his meal. He roasts his meat and eats his fill. Also he warms himself and says, I am warm. I see the fire. From the rest he makes a god his idol. He bows down to it and worships. He prays to it and says, save me, you are my God. When I was younger and I read this passage, I thought it was really funny. And there's definitely kind of a comedic tinge to this. Look at this fool who plants a tree and watches it grow and cuts it down and works hard to kindle a fire and then acts amazed that there's a fire. Look, here's a fire. Dude, you planted the tree, you chopped it down, of course there's a fire. He fashions a god from it, and after he does all the work of planting this tree, helping it grow, cutting it down, making some fire, baking his own bread, then he carves a god and says, save me. This God wouldn't even exist if you hadn't made him. That was funny. Until I started being able to put names to people who I saw living their lives in that way. A little bit later in verse 20 of Isaiah 44, Isaiah says, such a person feeds on ashes. A deluded heart misleads him. He cannot save himself. He cannot say, is not this thing in my right hand a lie? Feeds on ashes. There's no nourishment in a life of worshiping idols. There's no protein there. There's nothing that's going to sustain you spiritually. It's a feast where every plate is filled with ash. In Babylon, if you have rejected the idea that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob cares for you, looks out for you, is worthy of your worship, and you turn to the false idols of Babylon, you find yourself dining on ashes. Now, very few of us have been tempted to worship Babylonian idols recently. There may be one or two of you who have a secret shrine to Marduk in your bedroom closet, and if so, the elders would like to pray with you about that after church. But that's probably not our temptation. But I do see people who, when they hit that rock bottom moment of their lives, not convinced that God is going to be there for them, turn to something that will bring them false comforts, false pleasures. Whether that's alcohol, or whether that's sexual indulgence, or whether that's greed and buying all the cool stuff you can buy in the hopes that it brings you some joy, or whatever your particular indulgence is. For me, my way of dining on ashes was isolation. I'll just fall into the myth that if I could get rid of all other humans, my life would be swell. Because I'll just go out all by myself and then things will be great. You know what would help me recover from tragedy? I will go be alone for a long time with no human source of comfort or consolation or friendship. That'll be awesome. That was a feast of ashes. But that's my own personal indulgence. It was never alcohol for me. It was, I'm just going to go cut myself off from the world. So in the early parts of this section, Isaiah 40 through 45, we have these contrasts. God calling, offering comfort, calling for a community of mutual comfort and healing to be formed, but people tempted to dine on ashes, to live in these ways that are ultimately not satisfying. Last week when Mark preached, he addressed the theological questions directly that underlie this section. Is God powerful enough to act? And if he is powerful enough to act, does he care to act? And Isaiah answers both those questions with a resounding yes. Yes, he is powerful enough, and yes, he does care. Rest assured that the God who made the heavens and the earth has overseen all of this situation And when he calls to you that your time of hardship is over, that his words can be trusted. And now we come to the last of this section dealing intensely with the aftermath of the exile. And I want to focus especially on the final chapter of this section. We have a new call issued by the prophet. And Isaiah chapter 55 begins with a word in Hebrew that is probably not present in your more modern English translations. They just skip over it. In older translations, you would see something like, lo, or behold. And I guess what happened is nobody talks like that anymore. I mean, that would see, hey, Jimmy, lo, I've got a new PS4. Come over to my house. Behold these wonderful sandwiches that my wife hath prepared for us. The lows and beholds kind of seem weird to us, so we tend to skip over them. And they don't show up in your translations. My Hebrew professor recommended that we translate this word, hey, check it out. So just insert that before the first word of Isaiah 55. The prophet begins, hey, check it out. What are we checking out? Come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters. And you who have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread, and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me, and eat what is good, and you will delight in the richest of fare. Give ear and come to me. Listen that you may live. I will make an everlasting covenant with you. My faithful love promised to David. See, I have made him a witness to the peoples, a ruler and commander of the peoples. Surely you will summon nations you know not, and nations you do not know will come running to you because of the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, for he has endowed you with splendor. There is a promise in this passage, but there is also a deep challenge in this passage. If you do not have money, and I have been there, come, drink water for no cost. Get wine and milk for no money. Come get some bread, freely offered from the abundance of God. That sounds really good. Yes. Bring me into, and now we're back to Star Trek, right? With replicators that make whatever you want and it doesn't cost you anything. Yes, give me this abundant supply. Yes, put bread and wine and milk on my table without it costing me anything. That sounds great. What if you own the dairy? What if your job is the chief vintner at the vineyard? What if you're a master baker? How does this passage ring to you? What if you employ people at the lowest wage you possibly can, who are desperate for money so they can buy bread and milk and wine? And what if they now say, hey, I can get that stuff for free. I don't have to work for you anymore. How does this passage ring to you? I think in this final move of this section, God is dealing with a sort of different question. Yes, we have the people who are downtrodden. Yes, we have the people who are hurting and bruised, but then we also have the people who may be in an even more precarious spiritual situation. And those are the people who have weathered the tragedy just fine. Those are the people who found themselves in Babylon, in the most powerful, richest empire on earth and decided, the rules of my old life didn't work. I'm going to figure out the rules of this new life. And these are not people who are looking for comfort or consolation from idols necessarily. These are not people who are necessarily clinging to the ways of their ancestors and worshiping Yahweh. These are the people who have decided to make living life to the fullest within the vision of the Babylonian Empire their new way of living. And so, if you're smart enough, if you have the connections, if you have the talents to make your way up in Babylonian society and thrive, and you're now among the people who own the vineyards or who own the dairies or are right underneath the people who own those things, and you are doing well in the economy of the empire, this passage is a challenge for you. I haven't seen Grizzly Adams in a long time. I haven't watched Star Wars in a long time. It's been years since I've read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And you know what happened to me? There came a point where that longing for a new and a better and a different world, where that desire to knock on the back of every wardrobe and see if there's a secret entrance to Narnia, where that secret wish to sort of make sure that I don't have the Force, or maybe I do, faded away. And I decided to live my life by the ordinary rules of American society. Right? Go to college, get a job, set up that 401k, set up the 529 college education plan for my kids so that they can succeed under the rules of American society. Make sure that I am living under the standards of empire to the very best that I can. The challenge for me is what makes my life, what makes my priorities, what makes my choices any different than my peers who do not claim to worship God at all? What's the difference between how I spend my days, between where I set my priorities and people who live differently? And have I become so attached to the American way of life, where there is no such thing as a free lunch, that when God says, come get your free lunch, something within me says, I don't know if I want that. I don't know if I want that anymore. There are people who, after the tragedy, have thrived. And who, when God says, come back to your old lives, come worship in the old ways, come rebuild Jerusalem, will look and say, I kind of like it here in Babylon. They have a challenge. They're living in the most powerful, most prosperous nation on the earth in their generation, where there's abundant opportunity for the people who can take it and seize it, and where living the best possible life in material terms is open to them. And guess where we live? And the challenge of life in Babylon is a challenge for us as well. In the next section of chapter 55, Isaiah will say, seek the Lord while he may be found. Call on him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake their ways and the unrighteous their thoughts. And the best commentators that I have read on this passage interpret the wicked and the unrighteous here not as the Babylonians, but as Israelites who have gotten overly comfortable within the structures of Babylon, and who have left the ways of their ancestors, left the ways of their God, and are completely happy grasping power and money within this empire. Let these people turn to the Lord, and he will have mercy on them, and to our God, for he will freely pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. For 9.5 years of my life, I have lived very close to the Mexican border. In Laredo, Texas for 5 years, and Las Cruces, New Mexico for 4.5. When I was living in Las Cruces, I made a good friend in Juarez. Mexican family where the father of the family was a minister at the local Church of Christ and was doing everything he could do to support the desperately poor people in the neighborhood around him. I mean, desperately poor. Homes made out of shipping pallets. Water supplied by rain barrels in the backyard. Electricity stolen from the nearest power line by a series of very unsafe-looking extension cords running from home to home. When we were there, they would go out and buy bologna and make bologna burritos because bologna was a treat, the first meat they've had in a while. My friend Enrique worked at a maquiladora, and if you don't know what a maquiladora is, basically it's a factory owned by Americans and staffed by people in Mexico because you can pay much lower wages. And right across the border, there are tons of these places, 2/3 of them in the city of Juarez. And Enrique worked for a maquiladora. He bagged candy. That's what he did. Preacher in the evenings, minister in his spare time, bagging candy during the day. And I don't remember how low his wage is, but it was horrifyingly low. He bags this candy. The trucks come from American stores, load it up, take it across the border. And let me tell you something. When I am in Enrique's house, playing with his kids, meeting the desperately poor people of the neighborhood around him, when I visit the maquiladoras and see how hard he's working for such low wages, and then I go into the store and see one of the very bags of candy that Enrique has bagged, and I can buy this bag of candy ridiculously cheap because he's living in poverty. And I'm making 5 times what he makes, and it's right here for me to grab. When God says, come, turn the world around. Buy bread for no money. Get wine at no cost. Get milk at no cost to you. Enrique hears that and says, yes! I hear that and think, I was kind of doing okay the way it was. I'm on the right side of the border. I'm on the good side of the border. The side where it's easy to go buy the bag of candy that Enrique can't afford, even though he sits there and bags it all day. The call of God is to imagine a world that is not yet fully here. The Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. There are people who help me to see this. One of them is Martin Luther King and his writings. And I reread this week his acceptance speech as he was presented the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Let me give you his words. I accept this award today with an abiding faith in America and an audacious faith in the future of mankind. I refuse to accept despair as the final response to the ambiguities of history. I refuse to accept the idea that the isms of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in the river of life. unable to influence the unfolding events which surround him. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I refuse to accept the cynical notion that nation after nation must spiral down a militaristic stairway into the hell of thermonuclear destruction. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. By the way, when I get my tattoo, that is what it will say. I believe that unarmed love and unconditional truth will have the final word in reality. This is why right temporarily defeated is stronger than evil triumphant. I believe that even amid today's mortar bursts and whining bullets, there is still hope for a brighter tomorrow. I believe that wounded justice lying prostrate on the blood-flowing streets of our nations can be lifted from this dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men. I have the audacity to believe that peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. I believe that what self-centered men have torn down, other-centered men can build up. I still believe that one day mankind will bow before the altar of God and be crowned triumphant over war and bloodshed, and nonviolent redemptive good will proclaim the rule of the land. And the lion and lamb shall lie down, and every man shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and none shall be afraid. This faith can give us courage to face the uncertainties of the future. It will give our tired feet new strength as we continue our forward stride toward the city of freedom. When our days become dreary with the low hovering clouds and our nights become darker than 1,000 midnights, we will know that we are living in the creative turmoil of a genuine civilization struggling to be born. We will know that we are living in the creative turmoil of a genuine civilization struggling to be born. Jesus Christ came to announce a new way of living, to fulfill the call of the prophet Isaiah. And you notice as you read through the words of Christ, if you're rich and comfortable, some of it makes you a little bit uncomfortable, I hope, because when he blesses people, well, you know the beginning of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. But as for you rich, woe unto you who are rich, for you have received your reward in full. People read Isaiah 55 and say, it can't happen. Cannot be. How can you have a society where there is no poor? How can you have a society where everybody is taken care of? How can you have a community where every person has what they need? And all I can tell you is the early church, by the power of the Spirit and led by the vision of the prophets and the Lord Jesus Christ, did this. Acts chapter 4, the end of the chapter, all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own. Ouch. But they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them. For from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales, and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. The early church in Jerusalem caught the vision, the Isaiah vision of bread for free, wine and milk for those who need it. They rejected the rules of their empire, the Roman Empire, that said acquire, build power and money and nest egg, and willingly sold houses and land to be sure that their brothers and sisters had bread to live for the day. It's a completely un-Babylonian way of living. A completely un-Roman way of living. Is it too controversial for me to say it's a very un-American way of living? When the economy of God breaks into the culture of our empire and says, these are not my thoughts, these are not my ways are higher and better and different. And what comes as comfort to the poor is a challenge for the comfortable. Arundhati Roy, Indian writer who her country knows the difficulties of living with the power of empire, said in an essay, another world is not only possible, she's on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Can you sense the world that God is trying to bring to fruition among us? His kingdom, His ways, His rule, the way it challenges and comforts those who need to be challenged and those who need to be comforted. Let me close with the final words of this section. Isaiah 55, verse 10 and following. As the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return to it without watering the earth and making it bud and flourish so that it yields seed for the sower and bread for the eater, so is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but it will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it. You will go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and hills will burst into song before you, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. Instead of a thorn bush will grow the juniper, and instead of briars the myrtle will grow. This will be for the Lord's renown, for an everlasting sign that will endure forever.